Have you ever been told you're too intense, too emotional, too loud? Maybe not in those exact words, but you felt it. In the silences, the sideways glances, the moments when your enthusiasm was met with discomfort, your fire met with a fire extinguisher. Somewhere along the line you learned to contract yourself, to fold your laughter in half, dim your brilliance, question your instincts. And slowly, painfully, you became less outspoken, less visible, less you. But what if I told you that this wasn't your flaw? It was their fear. This video is not about becoming more. It's about undoing the lie that said you were ever too much in the first place. Inspired by the ideas of Carl Jung, we're going to explore how our culture, our families, and even our own unconscious minds convince us to betray the fullness of who we are. Jung believed that to become whole, we must integrate the parts of ourselves we've buried. And often those parts are the very traits others told us were too much. So let this be an invitation, not to shrink, not to apologize, but to begin again, to return to the place where you abandoned yourself. Because your sensitivity, your passion, your voice, they were never the problem. They were the parts of you trying to survive in a world that taught you to disappear. Let's begin at the root of the wound, the origin of too much, the moment your expression became a threat. There's a moment, often in early childhood, when a person learns that being fully expressive is dangerous. It might not have come with explicit punishment. Sometimes it was simply a parent's sigh, a teacher's scolding look, or a peer's mocking laughter. These subtle cues create an invisible boundary line. Cross it, and you risk exile. Jung believed that children are born with an innate wholeness, a self that includes both light and shadow. But to survive socially, that self is fractured. The traits that are inconvenient or overwhelming for caregivers are pushed into the unconscious, not because they're wrong, but because they threaten the comfort of others. Too much isn't a real measurement, it's a reflection of someone else's threshold. Your intensity only becomes too much when it challenges someone who doesn't know how to hold it. When your tears make someone squirm because they were never allowed to cry. When your joy reminds someone of what they had to bury. And so your full aliveness becomes disruptive, even offensive. But this is not about you. It's about what your expression activates in others. Your too muchness is not the poison. It's the mirror. And here's where the distortion begins. The child internalizes this discomfort as a personal flaw. Instead of seeing the adult's reaction as their limitation, the child concludes, "I'm the problem." That's the tragedy. Because the moment that belief takes root, authenticity is replaced with adaptation. The child doesn't just stop crying. They stop being. They suppress their curiosity, their anger, their desires. They become manageable, acceptable. And in that trade, they lose something sacred, the unfiltered, undomesticated self. Jung warned that anything rejected from consciousness doesn't disappear. It hides in the shadow. And what we repress, we eventually forget we ever had. So we grow into adults who say, "I don't really get angry," or "I'm not creative," or "I'm just a quiet person," never realizing these were once vivid traits until someone taught us they were too much. But beneath the layers of performance, that original self waits, not to be improved, but to be reclaimed. There's a quiet violence in the way we teach children to be small, not by bruising their skin, but by bruising their emotions, by making their feelings conditional. From an early age, many of us learned that certain emotions were acceptable, while others were not. We could be cheerful, but not angry, cooperative, but not assertive, soft, but not too soft, lest we be called weak. What we didn't realize was that this wasn't just emotional guidance, it was a survival manual. And it trained us, subtly but effectively, to shrink ourselves. Jung emphasized that repression is not forgetting. It's an active, unconscious decision made to ensure belonging. But when your natural emotional responses are consistently invalidated, you begin to repress not just your feelings, but your very presence. Emotional shrinking is not a choice. It's a survival instinct. It happens when expressing your truth led to withdrawal of love, or worse, emotional abandonment. Over time, you begin to anticipate rejection before it even happens. You censor your words, water down your feelings, and perform a version of yourself that feels safer. And though this earns you approval, it also creates a haunting disconnection. You're liked, maybe even admired, but not known. You feel invisible even when surrounded by others. This is the cost of emotional shrinking. You survive, but at the price of your authenticity. And slowly, the inner voice that once guided you becomes faint, distant, and drowned out by the voices of who you were told to be. Jung would call this voice, the one you've silenced, part of the self, longing for integration. The emotions you suppress don't vanish. They simply migrate to the unconscious and reappear in dreams, anxiety, outbursts, or depression. Your psyche doesn't forget what you've buried. It waits. And it will nudge, whisper, or even scream. When the gap between who you are and who you pretend to be becomes unbearable, that inner ache you feel when you downplay your needs or laugh at things that hurt you, that's not weakness. That's your integrity trying to speak. Emotional shrinking may have kept you safe once, but now it keeps you from wholeness. What's dangerous is that emotional shrinking often disguises itself as emotional maturity. You tell yourself you're just being calm or rational, when really, you've numbed the parts of you that were once vibrant and alive. You confuse silence for peace. But numbness isn't serenity. It's suppression. And living that way creates an internal split. The outer you becomes manageable, while the inner you becomes exiled. Jung believed that healing requires bringing the unconscious into consciousness, inviting those hidden parts back into the room, not to be judged or fixed, but to be felt and honored. Because your emotions were never the enemy. They were the messengers carrying you back to yourself. The good child doesn't cry too loud, doesn't ask too many questions, doesn't make people uncomfortable. They're praised for their politeness, their quietness, their maturity, beyond their years. But behind that praise is often a tragic misunderstanding. Because the good child persona is rarely born from true contentment, it's born from fear. Fear of rejection, fear of upsetting the fragile adults around them. Carl Jung described the persona as the mask we wear to meet the demands of the environment, and for many, the first mask we ever wore was that of the compliant, well-behaved child. We didn't become good because we wanted to. We became good because we had to earn love, to avoid chaos, to stay invisible where being seen felt unsafe. What's deceptive is that this persona is deeply rewarded. Adults love the quiet child, the helper, the overachiever. They don't see the emotional labor behind the performance. They don't see the way the child scans every room for tension, learns to predict mood shifts, internalizes the responsibility for everyone's happiness. And so, a dangerous association forms. If I'm good, I'm loved. If I'm honest, messy, or needy, I'm a burden. This belief follows us into adulthood. We continue to play the role long after the original danger is gone. We people please in relationships. We overfunction at work. We suppress our needs so well that we start to forget we even have them. But under the surface, the real self is still waiting, resentful, exhausted, and desperate to breathe. The danger of living through the good child mask is that it erodes intimacy, especially with yourself. You become so focused on who others need you to be that you lose track of who you actually are. Even moments of joy feel muted, filtered through the lens of appropriateness. You might find yourself asking, why can't I feel anything fully? Or why does everything feel like performance? That's the shadow of the persona speaking. According to Jung, the persona is necessary. We all need a face to meet the world. But when we become the mask, when we mistake it for our true identity, we lose access to the richness and spontaneity of the self. We trade depth for safety, and in doing so, we forget that love earned through performance is not love. It's survival. Healing begins the moment we question the rewards of being good. What did it cost you to be so reliable? Who did you have to abandon to keep others comfortable? When we ask these questions, we begin peeling back the layers of the persona. We start to feel what we were never allowed to feel. Grief, rage, boundaries, desire, And in doing so, we reclaim our complexity. Jung believed that true individuation, the path to wholeness, requires us to confront and integrate the parts we've exiled. The good child doesn't need to be destroyed. They need to be thanked and then gently retired, because you were never meant to be a role, you were meant to be a person. At some point, the good child cracks. The silence becomes unbearable. The pretending feels like betrayal. And so, the rebellion begins. Not always loud, not always dramatic, but a quiet refusal to keep shrinking. Maybe it starts with saying no for the first time, or expressing a long-buried opinion. Maybe it's crying in front of someone after years of holding it in. And in those moments, there's a flicker of liberation. But then comes the backlash, the look of disapproval, the sudden withdrawal of affection, the tension in the room. And just like that, rebellion gives way to shame. Jung believed that shame is the soul's response to self-betrayal, but also to exile. When we show our true selves and are punished for it, we internalize the message, being me is dangerous. This is how we learn that expression comes with a cost. That authenticity threatens the systems around us, family dynamics, social roles, even friendships. So we recoil. We replay the moment of vulnerability over and over, wondering what we did wrong. We apologize for our tone, our tears, our truth. And slowly, we begin to equate self-expression with rupture. We stop trusting our instincts. We filter our feelings through the question, will this make people uncomfortable? This is not emotional intelligence, it's trauma management. It's the residue of a world that told you love is fragile and your truth is too heavy to carry. But the damage runs deeper. The more we shame ourselves for expressing, the further we drift from our inner compass, and the more easily we become manipulated by outer forces. Rebellion isn't always anger. It can be creativity, sensuality, sensitivity. All forms of raw, unfiltered life that refuse to be boxed in. But when these expressions are met with rejection, they retreat into the shadow. And what lives in the shadow becomes twisted. A suppressed voice becomes a harsh inner critic. A repressed desire becomes addiction. A buried truth becomes self-sabotage. Jung warned that what we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. So when your natural expressions were shut down, they didn't disappear. They became unconscious drivers of your behavior. And until you reclaim them consciously, you'll keep reenacting the same emotional patterns. Self-expression, followed by guilt, followed by silence. A cycle that only ends when you decide to stop apologizing for being whole. Healing begins when we recognize that shame was never proof of wrongdoing. It was proof of misattunement. You were shamed not because you were too much, but because someone else couldn't meet you there. Maybe they were overwhelmed, emotionally illiterate, or threatened by your light. But that was their limitation, not your fault. Reclaiming your voice doesn't mean becoming loud or aggressive, it means becoming true. It means standing in your inner knowing, even when your hands shake. Jung wrote that individuation, the journey to self, requires us to retrieve the pieces we lost to fear. So let the rebellion continue, not as rage, but as reclamation. Because the cost of self-expression was never your truth. It was the illusion that you had to earn permission to be real. It's easy to believe the people who told you to shrink were right. After all, they had the power. They raised you, taught you, praised you when you obeyed, and grew cold when you didn't. But what if their reactions weren't reflections of your worth, but revelations of their own fear? Carl Jung believed that what we reject in ourselves we unconsciously project onto others. So when your laughter was too loud, your questions too much, your energy too intense, it wasn't about you. It was about the parts of them they couldn't face. Your freedom reminded them of their own repression. Your passion triggered their numbness. Your truth poked at their buried lies. And instead of turning inward, they turned on you. In emotionally immature systems, the expressive child becomes the scapegoat. Not because they're flawed, but because they disturb the false peace. You became the lightning rod for their unresolved wounds. This is especially true in families built on silence, secrecy, or emotional rigidity. The child who asks why becomes a threat. The one who cries openly is seen as weak. The one who sets boundaries is labeled selfish. But in truth, you were never the problem. You were the mirror. And in that mirror they saw everything they had abandoned in themselves. Jung called this the shadow, the unconscious repository of all that the ego refuses to acknowledge. When someone has disowned their own vulnerability, your sensitivity, will feel dangerous. When they've buried their own truth, your voice will sound like rebellion. But here's the tragedy. Instead of recognizing your radiance as a gift, they treated it as a flaw to correct. And so, you learned to tone yourself down, not because you were too much, but because they were too disconnected. Over time, their fears became your beliefs. You started to censor yourself without even thinking, to anticipate rejection before speaking, to smile when you felt like screaming. And that adaptation kept you safe, but it also kept you small. You internalized their fear as your identity, and now, even when you're free from their control, their voice still echoes inside you. Don't say that. Don't feel that. Don't be that. But it's not your voice, it never was. It's the inheritance of someone who never learned how to love what they couldn't control. The first step to liberation is this: recognize that they were afraid, not just of you, but of themselves, of the chaos within them, of the unlived life knocking at their door. They didn't shrink you because you were dangerous, they shrank you because aliveness felt dangerous to them. So you don't need to keep carrying their fear like it's sacred. You can put it down. Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But that terror is the gateway to freedom. When you see that their discomfort was never your responsibility, you reclaim your right to be whole. Not in rebellion, not in bitterness, but in truth. Because healing isn't about proving them wrong. It's about finally seeing yourself clearly, without the fog of their projections clouding your light. Somewhere along the way, you learned to become digestible, not because it felt right, but because it felt safer. You toned down your voice, softened your opinions, and rehearsed your facial expressions like a performer, trying to please a hostile audience. You smiled through discomfort. You laughed when you felt like crying. You pretended not to know things you deeply understood, just to avoid intimidating someone. And every time you did this, you were praised. People said you were easy to be around, mature for your age, or so understanding. But what they really meant was, thank you for not making us deal with the full weight of who you are. And over time, that praise became addictive. It convinced you that shrinking was noble, that self-erasure was a virtue. But here's the shadow of being palatable. It requires you to abandon the parts of yourself that carry power. Your fire, your wildness, your grief, your desire. The very elements that give you depth, that connect you to your soul, are the ones you had to suppress in order to be accepted. Jung spoke often about the cost of disowning our inner reality. When we cut off these vital energies, they don't disappear, they mutate. Repressed anger becomes chronic fatigue. Silenced desire becomes passive aggression. The habit of saying yes when you mean no turns into bitterness and resentment, and eventually you forget who you were before the performance began. You've become so good at being what others need you to be that you no longer know what you actually want. This loss of self is subtle but devastating. You may look functional on the outside. You show up to work, keep relationships, meet obligations, but inside you feel numb, like something is missing and you can't quite name it. That emptiness is the cost of being palatable. You traded authenticity for approval. You exchanged your edge for belonging. But the belonging you received wasn't real. It was conditional. It required you to leave pieces of yourself at the door. And now, even when you're praised, it doesn't satisfy you. Because deep down, you know you're being loved for a version of you that isn't whole, and no amount of external validation can fill the void left by your own absence. Reclaiming your power begins with recognizing the ways you've made yourself small. Not to blame yourself, but to forgive the part of you that thought it was the only way to survive. There's nothing weak about adaptation. It was brilliant. It kept you alive in a world that punished your fullness. But now, you're not that child anymore. You don't have to keep proving you're safe by being invisible. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming your true self, requires reintegrating what you once exiled. So start small, speak when you want to, rest when you're tired, say no without explanation. Let your full self exist. In the room, even if someone flinches, because power doesn't mean dominance, it means presence, and your presence, unmasked and unedited, is more than enough. From early childhood, you were taught that humility meant disappearing, that confidence was arrogance, that brilliance was boastful unless it came cloaked in apology. These lessons weren't delivered as overt rules, but through subtle feedback. Raised eyebrows when you spoke too boldly, discomfort when you took up space, whispers that warned, "Don't be too full of yourself." Society conditions us to believe that playing small is virtuous, that being agreeable, quiet, and self-effacing makes you more lovable, more employable, more human. But beneath that conditioning lies a deep discomfort with radiance, because radiance disrupts the order of things. It demands attention. It challenges mediocrity. It reminds people of what they've given up in order to fit in. And so instead of honoring your light, the world often asks you to dim it. Radiance in this context isn't about perfection or ego. It's about authenticity in its fullest form. It's the unapologetic expression of your truth, your talents, emotions, insights, and contradictions. Jung would say that to live radiantly is to embody yourself, the totality of your being beyond the masks. But this kind of presence is threatening to systems built on control. In schools, students who question authority are labeled disruptive. In workplaces, those who challenge norms are seen as difficult. In relationships, deep emotional intensity is pathologized as being too much. The message is clear: conform or be cast out. And so, radiance becomes risky. You learn to shine just enough to be accepted, but not so much that you become a mirror reflecting the unexpressed lives of others. There's a reason why society glorifies relatable over remarkable. It's more comfortable to celebrate people who struggle within the same limitations than those who break through them. When someone embodies their full potential, it exposes the internal compromises others have made. And instead of being inspired, people often feel threatened. So they project. They call your confidence narcissism, your passion drama, your ambition selfishness. But these judgments aren't about you. They're about the collective fear of what happens when someone chooses wholeness over approval. Jung taught that the crowd tends to turn against the individuated person precisely because they are no longer controllable. They no longer obey the unconscious rules that keep everyone small, and that nonconformity becomes a kind of heresy. But here's the truth. Your radiance is not a threat. It's a reminder of what we all once were before we were taught to be less. When you shine, you give others permission to reclaim their own light. When you speak honestly, you create space for truth. When you live boldly, you disrupt the lie that safety only exists in sameness. And yes, there will be backlash. Not everyone is ready to remember who they are, but the price of smallness is too high to keep paying. Radiance is not arrogance, it's alignment. It's the natural expression of a self no longer fragmented by fear. So let your fullness be seen, not to provoke, not to prove, but simply to exist as you are. Because every time you refuse to shrink, you widen the path for others to stand, tall beside you. The tragedy of trying to be lovable is that you often end up abandoning the very parts of yourself that are most alive, the ones that danced too loud, felt too deeply, wanted too much, or questioned what wasn't meant to be questioned. These were the pieces that made you vivid, raw, untamed, real. But you learned they were inconvenient, so you locked them away, piece by piece, not out of shame at first, but out of necessity. To be safe, to be accepted, to belong. And in doing so, You taught yourself to smile through betrayal, to apologize for crying, to keep your hands folded even when your spirit screamed, to reach for more. You became a version of yourself shaped more by fear than desire. But those exiled parts never disappeared. They waited. They waited for you to remember that survival is not the same as living. Jung believed that the path to healing is not found in perfection, but in integration. That wholeness isn't about being only the light, but about reclaiming what we've pushed into the shadow. The parts of you that were silenced didn't die. They became symptoms: anxiety, depression, numbness, rage. They surfaced as creative blocks, emotional exhaustion, or self-sabotage. They leak out in your relationships when you overreact or shut down. And the mistake we often make is trying to fix these symptoms instead of listening to them. Because beneath the discomfort lies a deeper truth. Something inside you wants to come home. Not to the image you've constructed, but to the self you left behind while chasing approval. Healing means turning inward and asking, what part of me have I abandoned just to be loved? Reclaiming those parts isn't glamorous. It's messy. It often begins with grief. Grieving the years you lived as a fraction of yourself. Grieving the people you let close who never truly saw you. Grieving the opportunities you passed up because they didn't fit the version of yourself you were pretending to be. But within that grief is gold. Because for the first time you stop abandoning yourself. You start making room for the parts you were told to hide. Your anger, your sexuality, your creativity, your truth. You begin to parent yourself with compassion instead of judgment. You create boundaries, not to punish others, but to protect the self you're learning to love again. And slowly the fragments become a form, not perfect, not always understood, but whole. And whole is enough. This reclamation is not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before the world convinced you to forget. Before, love became a transaction. Before authenticity was labeled dangerous. Before silence was safer than truth. And as you reintroduce yourself to these long-lost parts, something miraculous happens. Your energy returns. Your creativity flows. Your relationships deepen. Because you're no longer negotiating your existence. You're no longer offering pieces of yourself in exchange for connection. You are being fully and without apology. And in that being, you rediscover a kind of love that doesn't require shrinking. A love that begins with you and radiates outward from your own reclaimed soul. The phrase "too much" is not an objective truth, it's a verdict handed down by unseen judges within and around us. But too much for who? This question cracks open the illusion of the internalized standard that shapes so much of our self-judgment. Society, family, culture, all of these systems imprint on us a blueprint of what is acceptable, manageable, or lovable. We absorb these silent rules like water in a sponge, internalizing boundaries that were never ours to begin with. The too much label is a reflection of collective discomfort with intensity, complexity, and authenticity. It is a mirror held up by those afraid of their own depth, projecting their limitations onto you. And when you accept this internalized standard without question, you effectively become a prison warden of your own soul. Jung's concept of the shadow reveals how these internalized judgments live within us, not just as external voices, but as fragmented parts of the self that have been rejected and silenced. The too much you hear echoes in these shadows, whispers of fear, shame, and self-repression that prevent you from fully expressing who you are. But what if the internalized standard is simply a mask for collective fear? Fear of chaos, fear of disruption, fear of the unknown that comes with genuine self-expression. When you start asking too much for who, you begin to loosen the chains of these inherited fears. You begin to see that the boundary between too much and just right is not a fixed line, but a subjective judgment shaped by the needs and insecurities of others, not your own intrinsic worth. Challenging the internalized standard is an act of rebellion, and a necessary one for growth. It requires courage to face the voices that have whispered in your ear for years, telling you to shrink, to mute your desires, to make yourself smaller for the comfort of others. It means questioning the origin of these voices. Whose safety do they really serve? Who benefits when you stay quiet? When you challenge these internalized norms, you disrupt the cycle of compliance that keeps you trapped in self-doubt. Jung taught that the process of individuation, the journey to wholeness, is not comfortable, but it is liberating. It demands that you step into the discomfort of being seen fully, without apology, and rewrite the story you've been told about your too muchness. This questioning opens a path to radical self-acceptance. It invites you to reclaim your right to exist without limits imposed by fear or judgment, to define your own boundaries, your own measure of enough, and to recognize that what feels too much to one person may be just right, or even inspiring to another. This shift from internalized standards to personal truth is transformative. It allows you to shed the armor of self-criticism and live more authentically. Jung believed that true freedom lies in embracing all parts of yourself, the light and the dark, the quiet and the loud, the small and the vast. When you reject the false limits of too much, you reclaim your full spectrum and step into a life that reflects your genuine, unfiltered self. The pursuit of acceptance is one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior, and often the source of profound inner conflict. We learn early that to be loved, we must fit into molds designed by others, suppressing parts of ourselves that feel too loud, too dark, or too unconventional. But what if this acceptance is conditional, dependent on the parts you choose to show? Jung's teachings urge us to look beyond the craving for acceptance from others and instead turn toward a deeper, more radical goal: wholeness. Wholeness means embracing every aspect of yourself, the fragmented, the rejected, the celebrated, and reclaiming your integrity as a complex, evolving being. It's not about pleasing the world, it's about being complete within yourself. Choosing wholeness over acceptance requires courage because it dismantles the safety net of external approval. It demands confronting the parts you've hidden or denied, often for decades. It asks you to sit with uncomfortable emotions, to meet your shadows with compassion rather than judgment. Jung believed that the path to individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, requires this inner alchemy. It is the difficult but necessary journey of integration, where you cease to be a fragmented self and begin to live as a unified whole. In this wholeness, you no longer need the approval of others to validate your existence. You become your own source of acceptance, your own sanctuary. This shift transforms how you relate to the world. Instead of shrinking or muting yourself to avoid rejection, you show up fully, even if that means sometimes being misunderstood or pushed away. Wholeness doesn't guarantee comfort, it guarantees authenticity. It invites you to live in alignment with your inner truth, expressing your full range of emotions, desires, and beliefs without apology. Jung saw this as the ultimate form of freedom, the liberation from the unconscious forces that compel us to hide or diminish ourselves. When you prioritize wholeness, you move from surviving on the terms of others to thriving on your own terms, no longer fractured but grounded in a profound self-knowledge. Becoming fully yourself again is a reclaiming of your birthright. It is an invitation to live with integrity, creativity, and courage in a world that often rewards conformity. It challenges you to redefine what it means to be loved, not as a condition imposed by others, but as an unshakable truth you hold within. This journey is ongoing, unfolding with patience and persistence. But the reward is immeasurable. A life where your spirit is free, your voice is clear, and your presence commands respect. Not because you fit in, but because you stand out as the whole, radiant being you were always meant to be. For too long, you've been told that being yourself is a threat, that your passion, your intensity, your uniqueness are burdens to others. But this message is not your truth. It's a reflection of fears that belong to the world, not to you. The journey we've explored in this video reveals that you are not too much. You were simply told to be less so others could feel comfortable. And in surrendering pieces of yourself for acceptance, you lost more than you realized: your power, your creativity, your joy, your wholeness. The path to reclaiming what was silenced is difficult, but it is the only way to live fully alive again, to live beyond the limiting definitions imposed by others, and step into your authentic self, radiant and unapologetic. This journey demands courage, honesty, and compassion. It requires confronting the shadow parts of yourself, the anger, the grief, the desires you hid away, and embracing them as vital aspects of your humanity. It asks you to challenge the internalized standards that labeled you too much, to dismantle the false beliefs that have kept you small. When you do this, something remarkable happens. You reclaim your voice, your presence, and your right to exist in the world exactly as you are. This is not a rebellion against others, but a return to yourself. A reclaiming of your birthright to be whole, to be complex, to be beautifully and unapologetically you. Remember, wholeness is not perfection. It's integration. It's allowing the light and the dark within you to coexist without shame or judgment. It's choosing to be fully seen, even when that visibility feels uncomfortable or risky. As Jung taught, the individuation process calls us to become who we truly are beyond masks and personas. And in doing so, we find freedom. Freedom from the need to shrink, silence, or diminish ourselves to fit in. Freedom to live boldly, authentically, and with deep self-acceptance. This is your invitation to stop asking for permission to be yourself and instead give it to yourself fully and without hesitation. You are not too much. You are a force of nature, an intricate mosaic of light and shadow deserving of love, especially your own. The world may have tried to quiet you, but it cannot erase the truth of who you are. So stand tall, speak your truth, and embrace your fullness. Because the world doesn't need you to be less. It needs you to be all of you. Your journey to reclaim your power starts now, with the simple but profound act of showing up fully, exactly as you are.